Most modern media, TV shows and movies alike, have the same kind of coloration to it all. It's a drab, drained of color or dark look to it. Now, a lot of people are saying the reason for this is because editing today is done digitally, and a lot of these digital editing products have, preset coloration patterns to them. So you can just click a button and the media is colored in the new fashionable way. But this doesn't explain why people resonate with the darker coloration. If you were to show most people today, the images or footage from something like Sound of Music, Singing in the Rain, or just these older media that is more vibrant, more colorful, brighter, people do not resonate with it. They feel like it's childish, it's silly, cartoonish. Ultimately, people will feel like this more colorful media is unrealistic, whereas dark, drab, and colorless feels realistic. The reason isn't that it's, just fashionable, or that it's has something to do with, the editing process or the software that's being used. It has everything to do with what people today resonate with in terms of their view and their feel of life. To just give you an example, dark and gritty are synonymous with realistic or true to life. Things that are light, bright, colorful, that's all synonymous with childish, cartoonish, silly, unserious, unrealistic. And what's important too is it's not just the film that looks this way. It's not just an aesthetic. It's also the entire settings and the characters that we see in the media today. The whole vibe is dark and gritty. The characters are not admirable. Most of the characters in the TV shows, like Game of Thrones or Queen's Gambit or any of these shows that look dark and drab, the characters are all either horrible people, at best they're slightly okay in certain ways. Most of them are murdering, graping, evil people. Some of the better ones are just sort of not awful in those ways. You never really see admirable, praiseworthy, or happy characters. And usually what happens in these shows or movies that are considered more realistic is usually just lots of misfortune, grape, murder. They present a world where evil, misery, and misfortune are the norm. So the coloration of the show or movie isn't just random aesthetic choice. It actually fits perfectly with the feeling of life that this show presents. So the show looks dark and depressing because the feeling of life presented in the show is dark and depressing. So really the distinction is that we live in a culture where people feel more resonant with dark, depressing, and malevolent views of the world, as opposed to bright, positive, nice views of the world. What people say is realistic is more their assessment of what they feel like is realistic. Right? We shouldn't take that as a given, as one is realistic and one is not realistic. That's how people feel about it. Because in the past, 100 years ago or whatever, people did not feel that way about life, which is why they didn't create art that looked that way. Sure, there was darker media, but that was not the norm. That's not how people felt about life. If you look at sculptures from the 1800s, they're beautiful, absolutely beautiful, and they represent, a world where people cared about life, cared about important values in life, like love or whatever it might have been that they were making the sculpture of. They took life seriously, as opposed to media today, where characters don't really believe in anything or don't really value anything. It's a world without values, where characters just sort of move from one event to the next without any real clear motivation or clear reason why they're doing anything. And that's what people resonate with, this feeling of dark, depressing purposelessness. Now, a lot of the arguments will be that bad things happen in real life, and it's just one of the sort of the modalities of all the emotions that we can feel in real life. But that's not really what's going on here. It's not simply that there are dark and depressing stuff being made and certain people resonate with it. It's that people consider it to be realistic. That's the important distinction here. Sure, positive and negative things happen in life. That should be recognized. The important part here is that what is seen as close to the essence of what life is really about. In other words, realistic. Someone sees Singing in the Rain and they say, oh, that's nice, but it's, that's not really what life is like. Life isn't happy and pleasant and bright and colorful. Or they see something like True Detective, which is extremely well made. What it is extraordinarily dark and depressing in its coloration, in the subject matter, in the story. And people will say that is close to how they feel about life. So again, it's not to do with just exploring the differences of emotional tones that can be experienced in life. Believe me, I have been to those dark places in life, but it's what people resonate with in terms of how they feel life is fundamentally about, what is important in life. And why this is because that's what art is. Art is a concrete form of how someone feels about the essence of life. So whether it's a beautiful painting of a happy couple together, showing that, this is something important in life. It gives you the emotional response of this is something essential to life. This is what life feels like in an important way. Or a movie that is colored in a very dark and depressing way, and all the characters don't really have values or principles and sort of move from one event to the next, committing horrible acts against each other with no real purpose. That's presenting how life feels in a deep, important way. So it's not simply a matter of taste that I'm pointing out. It's how people resonate with the important, fundamental connection to what is important in life. So basically, all modern art, and you can see this not just in fine art or TV shows, but also in things like video games. You can see this vibe of dark, depressing, malevolent sense of life being what people resonate with. Art is a really good litmus test for how a people feel about life. Do people feel that life is fundamentally a good, positive thing, that it's worth living? Or do they feel like it's a meaningless, purposeless slog through misery without any kind of meaning? In our culture, it is the latter. Modern media looks and feels so drab and colorless because we live in such a nihilistic culture, and that's how people feel about life. And what that really means is seeing life in a valueless way. People are not seen as being motivated by their choices in life or their values, what they care about, but rather are seen as motivated by, the chemicals in their body, or they're seen as motivated by their racial heritage, or they're motivated by market forces, or they're motivated by dark impulses like greed. We're basically seen as sacks of meat that move from one event to the next without choice or real meaningful purpose. And ultimately, you're left with this feeling that life is meaningless, life has no purpose, and we can't really comprehend what life is all about and what moves us, and ultimately there's really no point to. And that leaves you feeling like life is dark and mysterious and depressing. And that really is how people feel about life. I mean, depression and anxiety are through the roof, because of course, people are going to feel anxious when they feel like life is incomprehensible and frightening, which of course people are going to feel anxious and depressed when they feel like life is incomprehensible, unpredictable, and ultimately a negative, frightening place to be in. One day might be fine, whereas the next is this hell and you have no idea why or what caused it or what to do about it. And if you are feeling like, but that's what life is, that's what life does feel like. Life does feel dark and depressing. And that old stuff, anything that's positive or colorful or bright does feel cheesy and silly. Then that should simply tell you that that's how you feel about life. See, we so often can take these very fundamental feelings as a given. Like that's just how it is. Life is dark and depressing. But things like that are in our control. And why it's important to see that as under your control is because life is ultimately what we make of it. If we feel like life is dark and depressing and frightening and incomprehensible, then we're going to be racked with depression, anxiety, and a sense of hopelessness. And if you don't want that, you'll need to take control of how you feel about life. And that is why it is ultimately so important to take control of the art that you surround yourself with, is because art, the whole point of it is to shape how you feel about life. What are the important values that you have? What are the important principles that you stand by? Now I want to go into a little bit of cultural context now, which is when our culture began, the one we're in right now, which is really just when nihilism took over, modern philosophy, philosophies like Kantianism, all the philosophies that are based off of him, like Marx, Schopenhauer, and Hegel, and all those types. Those philosophies, took over around the late 60s or so. The whole hippie movement stuff was part of that. It was much bigger than simply that, but it was, that's really when things changed. If you just look at the movies of the time, and especially in the 60s, you started to see a real change. Like in the 50s, you had clear plots, clear characters with clear motivations. They cared about certain things. The drama was usually around whatever these characters cared about. And around the mid to late 60s, that started to change. Characters didn't really necessarily care about much of anything. Sometimes the characters just sort of drifted from one thing to another, like Once Upon a Time in the West. That's a really good example of what modern media is like. That's really what that modern philosophy movement was all about. Bringing in the modern philosophies that saw life as not about values, life not meaning anything. And that's really what dominates our world today. I find it really interesting that when you look at people on YouTube or whatever who are recommending older works to go watch, it's usually as old as about the 60s, with a few exceptions here and there. They typically don't go back further than that. And the reason is because of what I was talking about in this video, is because people cannot emotionally connect with that different culture. The culture that preceded ours. The important difference in the art is that they showed life as being important. They showed values as mattering. They might not be your values. A lot of them are not mine. I mean, someone like Dostoevsky, for example, really, really shows how important it is to care about life, how important it is to have principles and to have a system of values. And of course, he was, a Christian, which I am not. I'm not religious, but that doesn't matter really. Like in terms of art and what to get out of it, it doesn't matter the specifics necessarily. You can get a lot out of just the idea of caring about life, caring about something. And that's what you do not get in modern art. You do not get characters who are principled, who care about life. I think that's one of the main reasons why so many people, particularly younger people, are so drained of life. They don't connect with their own lives. And because of it, nothing really seems important. They just sort of drift from one thing to the next without any real sense of importance or meaning. But ultimately, it is so important that you surround yourself with media, with art on your walls, TV shows, music, whatever it might be, that reinforces the feeling inside of you that life is important and the things that you care about are important and that your choices in your life matter. And modern media just will not do that. It will do the opposite. It'll make you feel like, why bother? It'll make you feel like your choices don't really matter, that things are beyond your control, and ultimately life has no meaning. And that will leave you feeling anxious and depressed and disengaged with life. Anyway, so if you want a quick, easy way to get started with better art that will make you feel like life matters, definitely check out my art guide in the description below. And if you've already downloaded it, I will fill it out with a lot more content. I'll put more media on there for you to check out. It's been a long time since I've updated it, and I felt like it needed more more options on there for you. Well, this video has been a little bit more rambly, especially at the end. And if you liked it, let me know what you think, and I hope to see you next time. Thanks so much for watching.